I promised in an earlier video that I would talk about emergence. And emergence is something that happens in complex systems. We have different levels of explanation from small to large scale. So for example, the chemist looks at molecules, the biologist looks at proteins and cells, and the zoologist looks at animals, and at each level the behaviour of the system is not entirely predictable in terms of what happens at the lower levels. So you've got individuals, you've got social groups, you've got society as a whole, and at each level what happens as a pattern of social groupings, the society as a whole, is not entirely predictable from what happens at the lower level of individuals. I've been on the internet and I've had a look at what people say about emergence, and there's a lot of kind of magical thinking about emergence, and I don't want to be confused by that, the idea that in some ways consciousness is an emergent phenomenon. Well, it probably is an emergent phenomenon, but that's not the most interesting thing to understand about emergence. There's nothing magical about it. I may have used the word magical when I was describing the chaos game in an earlier video, the way the pattern emerges from the collection of individual actions, the way society develops as a result of individuals' actions. But think about this. If I put a group of friends together, there's a lively conversation, or there's a party, or there's a discussion, or there's an argument. The same friends I put together, or who come together occasionally, will have quite different outcomes depending on who knows what, but it's not necessarily predictable. You can't predict the chemistry of a group when they come together as a social group. That doesn't mean there's something special or magical about group behaviour. It's just a different level of understanding from the individual level. And when you try to understand society as a whole, you can understand the different political parties, the different political positions, and still you may not be able to understand everything about society. All that is to say is that the systems that we live in are underdetermined. We're still governed by an imagination from the 16th, 17th century that if we only understood everything, if we knew where every atom and every molecule was today, we'd be able to work out everything that would happen tomorrow. We're still confounded by that imagination, that insight. And all that emergence says is that's not even theoretically possible, that individuals come together and they form social groups, and you will see some patterns emerging. In a classroom of children, there will be somebody who, for some reason, is seen as an outsider. Child who's seen as an outsider and is perhaps being bullied. And I'm not suggesting for a moment we should condone bullying in any form, but we've all seen the person who defends themselves from being picked out by being the class clown. And that's a pattern of behaviour that occurs in social groups again and again, and we can recognise it, but we won't necessarily know beforehand. When we look at 30 profiles of individual children going into that classroom, we won't necessarily know who's going to defend themselves from hurt by being the class clown, or defend themselves from hurt by being very quiet, or defend themselves from hurt by being showing off. There will be lots of different strategies and lots of different people, and which people fit to which roles is not predetermined. So there's nothing magical about the fact that at a social group level, you can't understand everything that's going on by looking at the individual profiles of individuals. The same at the level of society, you can't understand everything that happens in society by looking at the social groups. And we are bedeviled by this vision of Pascal's demon that knows everything, can predict the future because they know where everything is. And that, what the butterfly effect is, in complexity theory, says the tiniest thing can have huge outcomes, differences in outcome from very small changes in input. And that's not a recipe for going and looking for those tiny changes that can produce, the nudge effect. We're going to look for the place where we nudge society in order to make it go in the direction we want. The butterfly effect is not about very tiny influences having a big effect. It's about unimaginably tiny, in theory, immeasurable differences making a difference. So that there's no point in going looking for them, and yet we're still trying to interpret complexity theory through the eyes of a 17th century philosopher who thought that the mechanical means of the understanding of the mechanical running of the universe would mean that free will and all of those human emotions disappeared, that they would simply be epiphenomena on the top of a kind of chemistry that was going on, or physics, and that it could all be understood. That's not what emergence is about. Emergence simply says, look at social groups. Not everything can be understood in terms of the individuals. You need to have something else. You need to look at social groups as social groups. And if you want to look at social activity, you need to go beyond the idea that it's based upon chemistry. It is, of course, based upon chemistry. But it's more than that. It's something in addition to that. If I arrange to meet some friends next 28th of March, there is sometime in the future, 28th of March, I've decided to go and meet a group of friends. We're going to get together, and we know we're going to get together. You will not understand that activity by looking at me. You can look at my brain processes, you can look at what causes me to do things, you can look at my motivation, you can look at all of those things, measure my personality traits. You will never work out what it means for me to make an appointment to meet some people in a few months' time. You won't get any closer to understanding it if you look at the things that I write in my diary and understanding the movements that I have to make in order to put a date in my diary. In order to understand what I'm doing, you have to understand what it means to make an appointment. You have to understand what it means to intend to go to a meeting. I can still have trouble, traffic jams, difficulties getting to the places, weather, violent storms, all sorts of things can happen that can disrupt it. But making a diary appointment, making a date, fixing a date to see people is a social activity. It's not an individual activity, and it has to be understood by looking at the social group. It might be interesting to look at the individuals. Am I the sort of person who keeps my appointments, or am I the sort of person who sometimes doesn't turn up for appointments or forgets them? Or you might look at there are some personal traits that might be relevant to the making of an appointment. You do a test of my memory and you discover that I can't remember things from one week to the next. You might say, this person doesn't understand what it means to make an appointment 2 months in advance. they can't possibly be doing it. So you might well inform your decisions about what's happening at social level by looking at the individuals, but it can't be totally explained. And that's the issue that we're looking at here, that education, generally speaking, is an activity of social groups. And however accurately and how tightly and with whatever refined instruments you look at individuals, it cannot inform what's happening in social groups and in society. So that's what emergence is about, and one of the tests that's I've seen mentioned for when we've got emergences is if you're looking at social groupings and you decide that there's nothing to be learned by going to the individual level, or at least only a limited amount to be learned from going to the individual level, you're looking at a phenomenon which is emergent. Relatively little of what happens in a social group can be understood by understanding the psychology of the individuals learn. Let's have a look at a historical case from physics which might illustrate this a little better. In the 17th century, Newton was looking at the motion of the planets. So he's looking at the movement of the planets around the sun, and he says that each individual planet travels in an ellipse. We can understand there's a gravitational force between the sun and the planet depending upon its distance from the sun, and we can understand the individual movement of that planet moving around the sun in terms of that force between the sun and the planet. So he's looking at individual planets moving in, and he can explain their motion in terms of the forces between the sun and the planet. And he believed, people at that time believed, the scientific method that we've used until very recently argued that if you could understand the parts, you would understand the whole. The solar system is made up of individual planets going around the sun. But there's also a force between planets. Depending on the distance between them, planets are attracted to each other by the same force of gravity that Newton described for the force attracting them to the sun. Now, nobody can solve the equations where there's more than one planet involved. So we can't work out what's going to happen in a system with more than one planet. We've assumed, because this was the scientific method until relatively recently, that if you look at the parts, you know all there is to know. Now, it happens that those attractions between the planets might disrupt the system in ways that we can't predict. It's just possible that if all the planets line up in a particular way, the forces will work to throw this one out of its orbit and it will end up somewhere different. It's just possible that all the planets will line up and catapult Earth out into deep space when we're not looking. Unexpectedly. Huge differences in outcome can occur from quite small perturbations in the inputs. Now, all of those motions are still governed by the laws that Newton put for individual planets. Always the force between the planets depends upon the distance between them, and we know how that works. What we don't know is how to aggregate them, and if you want to look at what happens to the planetary system, you need to have an understanding at the higher level. Now, the consequences of this are big. Not simply in terms of outcomes of results, but in terms of the way we imagine the world that we live in. Because if it's possible that one of these planets could be thrown out of its orbit. We presumed up until then, the influences would be so small between planets that the motions of the planets are now, as they have always been, very stable. They've always been like this. They've always been Mercury very close to the Sun, Saturn very far from the Sun, Earth somewhere in between. We've assumed that the orbits are like that. But once you've thought in complexity terms, once you've imagined things in complexity terms, you can imagine that the orbits of planets are less stable than you thought they were. And that opens up all sorts of possibilities for the scientists to say, Jupiter is a very odd planet to have formed at that distance from the Sun. We could understand it much better if it had formed somewhere differently and then moved to where it is now. And that opens up a whole range of possibilities in our imagination that we didn't have before. So the significance of emergence is at least partly that it encourages us to imagine things that we did not imagine before. And we need to be quite careful about that, not to dismiss ideas simply because science has told us that if you understand the parts, you understand the whole. We need to be developing new understandings about whole systems, which embrace possibilities that we had not necessarily previously ruled out, but we had previously ignored. We need to be careful about that. We need to be careful that we don't interpret emergence as something magical or mystical or spiritual or in some way making up for, like, I have free will, I exercise my free will, I also follow the rules of chemistry and the rules of physics. All that emergence is saying is that the following the rules of physics and the rules of chemistry do not rule out the possibility of free will, because I'm underdetermined. I'm not completely determined by the rules of physics and chemistry, not because the rules of physics and chemistry are incomplete or because they don't apply, but because there are lots of ways of being in conformity with the laws of physics and chemistry. There are lots of ways of being which conform to the basic lower levels, that at the higher level you find lots of ways of being yourself. And we all find different ways of being ourselves, even though basically at a chemical level we're all very similar. So emergence is not something that meets a need for explaining or creating something out of nothing that we needed. It's simply an alternative way of describing things that improves our imagination, and we must be wary not to fall into the trap of saying it says something that it's not saying. The butterfly effect, as we all know, says that a very small input can produce a very large difference in output. But it also says something else that is less often stressed, which is that sometimes really huge inputs have no effect at all. There's a huge storm today, tomorrow the weather can be as calm as anything. Huge differences in input can smooth out and disappear quite suddenly. I can get into a flaming rage today, and tomorrow I can be even-tempered, I will have recovered my temper. That's not to say that if I'm in a flaming rage today, you may not react to me rather differently tomorrow because you've seen me in a rage. But it's not always the case that tiny inputs produce large outputs, nor is it always the case that large inputs sometimes produce large outputs. And one of the problems with emergence is that there are still people trying to interpret it through the eyes of a 17th century physicist. They're still worrying about how is it that the individuals control the social group? How is it that the social group controls the individuals? And the word here is important, is control. And I think that we're going to have to, if we're going to understand emergence, rethink the idea of a cause and effect. We've been brought up on the idea that every effect has a cause and every cause has an effect. We're going to have to rethink this, and I'm not pretending that I know what the answer is. I'm not going to rethink it all by myself. Collectively, we need to be coming to a new understanding of what we mean by the words cause and effect. It's almost everywhere in our language. Why did you do that? Because of this. Why do they do that? Because of the other thing. It's because is such a common word in our vocabulary. It's such a common way of thinking that we think about control and responsibility in terms of cause and effect. Somebody's accountable for the things they can cause, they're not accountable for the things they can't cause. How does that translate if we think that individuals are not responsible or not entirely responsible for the actions of the groups that they're part of? So it's an important question, and I would go further and I would say that many of the social ills in our world today are caused by people wanting to control, trying to control things that cannot be controlled. No, I don't want to control my friends. I regard my friends as a rich and wonderful gift and source of inspiration and variety. And what happens when a group of my friends comes together is an experience that is beyond my control, thank goodness, because if I was in control of the conversation or the activities, a lot of the things that happen would not happen. Thinking about this in terms of, have you seen the biopic of Freddie Mercury? And Freddie Mercury feels constrained by the having to work with the other members of the band Queen, and when he's got money and wealth and fame, he tries to put together a band that will respond to his will and his alone. He will be the creative input for this new band. And it's a tragedy in the making that because of that friction, the grit in the oyster that comes from human relationships, that a band that responds only to one creative will is sterile. It doesn't produce anything like the wealth of emotion and music and experience that a group of people who are diverse and rub each other up the wrong way can produce. And so I think that we look around, and from people wanting to have controlling relationships that lead to stalking and abuse and violence, and choosing to have relations who are controllable, choosing to dominate children. There's a very strong strand of control freaks in teachers, I'm sorry to say. I share it. I mean, I'm not blaming other people for it, but wanting to control things that cannot be controlled is, I think, one of the major sources of evil in the world as we see it today. So an understanding of emergence, I think, has huge, huge implications. Has implications for how we live, has implications for how we do research, has implications for how we understand the universe that we live in, and above all, probably has implications for how we want to manage our friendships and our relationships. So emergence is not something I'm going to stress this again, it's not something magical. It simply says the situations that we get into are underdetermined. There is room for choice. There are many ways of being wrong. There are many ways of being right. There are many ways of engaging with other people. And although we have to conform to our physics, our chemistry, our psychology, that's not enough to explain how society works, how education systems work, how schools work. We need to develop between us a new imagination about what it means for things to happen and what it means to bring about events that we wish to happen.